Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. I am the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and I'm going to be answering your question, or one of your questions today. And of course, you too can ask a question. Remember that you can become a patron of the Patreon. All you need to do is go to www.patreon.com/ancient warfare podcast, and you can back us. And there's 3 different ways you can back us. And of course, you don't have to be a backer to ask us a question. We will attempt to answer any question you send through. And today's is from Lubos, who's a patron, and he asks, why was the Greek phalanx so ineffective against the Romans? Were they just obsolete, or just that the Greek generals didn't evolve their tactics and formations to counter Roman maniples? Right. Well, the first thing is, yes, indeed, the Greek phalanx on balance tends to be ineffective against the Romans. Having said that, the phalanx encounters the Romans some not quite 50 years after its peak under Philip and Alexander, and then it encounters the Romans in 280 BC for the first time, when Pyrrhus of Epirus invades Italy. And in that sense, when the phalanx encounters the Roman, not maniples, but the Roman triple line, it is more than a match. Well, it's a Pyrrhic victory, so it is a match, shall we say. Doesn't defeat, but doesn't lose either, to the Roman legion. So in that sense, it isn't always a victory to the Roman legions when it comes to encountering the phalanx. The 2 most decisive battles between the Roman legion and the Greek phalanx, as opposed to the Greek legion and the Roman phalanx — that is a bit of a mess, Murray — are of course the Battle of Skynoscephalai in 197 BC and the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. Those are the 2 climactic battles of those phalanxes. So in that regard, the phalanx is in contact with the Roman legion for a little more than a century. There are some battles into the 1st century BC where the phalanx is still being used by Mithridates and things, but they're not technically Greek phalanxes by that point, or Hellenistic phalanxes. And so in that time, as your question, Lubos, suggests, yes, indeed, the Greek warfare tends to have stagnated because, of course, the successor states of Alexander fight themselves generally. And so what you tend to get with the phalanx in that period is it basically turns into an arms race for the bigger phalanx. You get bigger phalanxes, more phalangites, more elephants, more cavalry. And they don't tend to think of tactical innovation to fight other phalanxes. It's a biggest is best. And in that regard, of course, they've forgotten one of the lessons that Alexander should have taught them, which, when you look at Alexander's use of the phalanx, he uses the phalanx absolutely as a holding formation. It holds the center, and he then stretches the right or the left wing of his enemy while he advances to the right, creating a gap in the enemy, and then he charges into that gap. What you find with the battles of the successors is they're doing that less and less. And it tends to be a front-on conflict. And what therefore happens is, when Pyrrhus goes to Italy, we find that exactly is what happens. The Roman system is able to absorb the phalangite attacks, and these battles are very even. And of course, Pyrrhus retreats back to Greece. Well, firstly, he goes to Sicily, then he comes back to Italy, then he goes back to Greece, and sort of licks his wounds. And there's a bit of a gap between that and the next sort of encounters of the Roman legion versus the phalanx. When the next sort of decisive battles come, especially Skynoscephalai and Pydna, in both of those cases, what you have is a battle where the phalanx is on unfavorable terrain, or it isn't drawn up correctly in time. And what you find, therefore, is that the Roman formation is able to defeat the phalanx, because it's much more flexible in terms of being able to operate in different types of terrain much more effectively than the Greek phalanx. One of the other problems with the stagnation of the Greek phalanx in the successor states is that they are looking for battlefields that suit the phalanx. And so lovely flat plains tend to be where they fight because both sides have a phalanx. And whereas when you start to look at some of these other battles, you find that they're fighting on terrain that doesn't suit a phalanx, and it becomes disrupted as it tries to cross hills or rough ground or creeks. And so it's basically caught at a disadvantage by the Romans in two cases, both in Skiphili and Pydna. And I mean, the funny thing about that, of course, is it's not to say that the Greeks, the successor states in the Hellenistic period, don't have other troop types. They do have light troops, cavalry, troops that are able to operate in broken terrain. We have lots of descriptions of, mercenary peltasts and mercenary archers who are given responsibility for covering broken terrain, and they do so very well. But the problem is that the status of the phalanx is unchallenged throughout that period, and so the phalanx will decide the battle. And again, these Greek generals have forgotten the lesson that Alexander taught them, which is, of course, that yes, the phalanx holds the enemy, but the phalanx in Alexander's battles doesn't decide anything. It does a purpose, but the battle is decided by his decisive cavalry charges. And so that, in a way, becomes less what Hellenistic warfare is about. You get cavalry versus cavalry to prove themselves, and phalanx versus phalanx, but there isn't this sort of attempt to draw out a line, create a gap, and charge that gap in phalanx versus phalanx warfare. And of course, what happens at Pydna especially is a gap occurs. The Romans decide to charge the flank of the phalanx. Oh my gosh, that's not something that you get in phalanx versus phalanx warfare. The attacking of a vulnerable phalanx flank, oh my gosh, that's a bit of a tongue twister, is something that the phalanx was always in danger of, and Alexander uses light troops and other troop types to protect the flanks of his phalanx. And what you find at Pydna is that the flanks of the phalanx are vulnerable, and the Romans take advantage of that. And again, I think it's also about command and control, that the centurions in the Roman army are in control of 80 men, and they can make independent decisions on the battlefield. Whereas in a phalanx, even though technically you've got a taxace or a taxus of 1,500 men, and you've got a file and you've got a half file, they don't tend to operate independently. The smallest sort of tactical unit of a phalanx is a syntagma of 256 men, and you don't really find them operating on their own very often at all. I think there's a couple of instances where we find one taxus being used, but not a single syntagma. And so in that regard, the Romans have the advantage because they've got more flexible, smaller units that can operate independently from one another, whereas one of the strengths of the phalanx is its unity. If you split it into bits, it becomes much less effective. And of course, on an individual soldier terms, the Greek phalangite is less well armored and armed than your Roman legionary. So in that sense, those, I hope, explains why they're ineffective eventually against the Romans. It's not that they're obsolete. A great general, another Alexander, could quite easily have used the phalanx to anchor the Roman infantry and then maneuvered the flanks of the Roman formation to create a gap that he could have charged decisively. That's what Alexander did. And I think an innovative general like that could quite easily have done that again. And that we don't find one of those, unfortunately. And yes, the Greek tactics of the phalanx do not evolve to overcome different foe types because they're generally fighting themselves. So I hope that answers your question. Join us again next time.